6 human figures appeared, floating along the row of old stone pillars, motionless. Ethan's heart sank. For a moment, he thought he had come too late. He stepped closer. The beam of his flashlight swept over pale faces, closed eyes, limp bodies. No cries for help, no signs of struggle, only the terrifying silence of early morning in a forgotten land. Then there was the faintest movement. A hand trembled. A fragile breath escaped from dry, cracked lips. Ethan held his breath, leaning in close. They were still alive. There was no time to think. Ethan rushed forward. The first knot came loose. The second girl was lowered to the ground. Then the third. Each second stretched tight like a drawn wire, cold sweat soaking down his spine even as the mountain wind sliced like a blade. When the last girl touched the ground, Ethan collapsed into the mud. 6 girls lay there, barely breathing, delicate as if they had just been pulled back from some invisible edge. A weak whisper slipped out, Lin Xiaoyu, before fading in his arms. Ethan looked up at the abandoned farm around him. For the first time, he understood. This $5 piece of land was not just forgotten. It was holding on to lives that someone else wanted to erase, and from this moment on, he could not turn away. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The sound of the ambulance faded into the distance, swallowed by the winding dirt road leading down the mountain. Ethan Cole stood alone in front of the farmhouse, his hands still trembling slightly, even though things had finally calmed down. The 6 girls had been taken away in critical condition, leaving behind a cold, empty space and a string of unanswered questions. The farm returned to its natural silence, vast, desolate, and abandoned, as if it had never truly belonged to anyone. Ethan looked around. Old wooden sheds, rusted tin roofs, leaning fence posts. There was nothing here of value, at least, not on the surface. And yet, it had been transferred to him for $5. Ethan remembered the afternoon he signed the inheritance papers. The notary had looked at him with puzzled eyes, as if he could not believe someone would accept a piece of land that locals called cursed. The previous owner, Samuel Cole, the uncle Ethan had only met a few times in his life, had passed away quietly, leaving the farm behind, along with a short note. If you can hold on to it, it will hold on to more for you than you expect. Back then, Ethan had only chuckled. He just needed a place to land, nothing more. Now, everything had changed. The local police arrived later. Sheriff Tom Caldwell asked a few routine questions, but his eyes seemed to avoid the land more than they focused on Ethan's story. No promises. No commitment to investigate further. Before leaving, he offered a vague remark, part suggestion, part warning. This is something best not dug into too deep. Ethan watched them go, unease blooming in his chest. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, a sleek black car rolled through the gate. A well-dressed man stepped out, his polite smile measured and practiced. He introduced himself as Richard Hale, a representative of a major agricultural company in the region. "This place comes with problems," Hale said lightly. "We're prepared to buy it from you, so you will not have to worry about a thing." He did not mention the 6 girls. Not a single question about the morning Ethan had just lived through. Only money. Ethan declined, politely but firmly. As the car disappeared into the twilight, darkness settled over the farm. Ethan stood in the middle of the open land, realizing for the first time, this $5 patch of earth was not just a place to stay. It was a place someone wanted erased, and maybe, just maybe, a place he was meant to protect. The small mountain hospital was strangely quiet. Ethan Cole sat on a bench in the hallway, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the emergency room door that had been closed for hours. The strong smell of disinfectant filled the air, but in his mind, He could still hear the wind howling from that morning and the broken, fading breaths he had nearly lost. A doctor stepped out, pulling off his mask. "They are out of danger," he said. "But they will need time." Ethan let out a long breath, as if only now he was finally allowed to breathe. Several hours later he was allowed in to visit. 6 beds in a neat row. 6 frail bodies, white bandages, wrapped around wrists and ankles. No one said a word. Only the steady beeping of heart monitors broke the silence, a quiet reminder that they were still here. The first to open her eyes was Lin Xiaoyu. Her gaze was lost, frightened, until it landed on Ethan. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Ethan leaned down, his voice low and slow, like he was speaking to a wounded animal. "You are safe now." Tears welled up at the corners of Xiaoyu's eyes. In the days that followed, bits and pieces of the story emerged, fragmented and incomplete. Zhou Ying, who knew a little English, became the only bridge. They had come from different provinces but were drawn by the same promise: steady work, money to send home, a new life. None of them had legal documents. None had dared to ask too many questions. Wang Fen, the oldest, said the farm was only a temporary stop. They were moved constantly, working in silence. Zhang Mei clutched the edge of her blanket whenever she mentioned the final night, as if letting go would cause everything to collapse. Chen Liwa said nothing, but her eyes remembered every detail: dirt roads, unmarked vehicles, faces that always turned away. Sun Qian was the weakest. She slept most of the time, occasionally waking up with a start, gasping, calling out for someone who was not there. Ethan listened without interrupting. And the more he heard, the more he understood. This had not been an accident. This was a system, one that ran smoothly thanks to the silence of many. That evening, Ethan returned to the farm. Wind pushed through the old wooden posts, making a brittle sound. He stood in the middle of the open field, the very spot where everything had changed that morning. 6 women had survived. But if he walked away now, others might never get that chance. And Ethan knew from this moment on, this $5 patch of land no longer gave him the right to stand aside. Just 3 days after the 6 girls were brought to the hospital, the farm had visitors again. Ethan Cole was repairing a section of the fence when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A gray pickup truck pulled up to the gate. Everything felt a little too on time. The man who stepped out was Richard Hale, still in a perfectly tailored suit, still wearing that polite smile, as if they were meeting in a sleek office with air conditioning, not standing in the middle of a farm that had just lived through a nightmare. "We have reconsidered," Hale said, his voice low and even. "The company is prepared to increase our offer." He named a number, much higher than before. Enough for Ethan to walk away tomorrow and never look back. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked around the old barns, the dirt road, the open patch of land where the morning mist had once hidden 6 lives. "You never asked about the people who were saved," he said. Hale smiled, as if that question were unnecessary. "Unfortunate things happen," he replied. "But bad press only makes land like this difficult to use." Difficult to use. 2 words, light as air, as if everything that had happened was just a smudge waiting to be wiped clean. Hale kept talking, calm and patient. The company had a plan for sustainable development, a major project, jobs, a bright future for the region. Everything would be simpler if Ethan signed and left soon. Ethan declined. The smile never left Hale's face, but something shifted in his eyes. "You should think it over," he said. "This land carries things that are not good for those who stay." The truck drove off at high noon. Dust settled slowly, leaving behind a heavy silence. Ethan stood there for a long time, feeling as if he had just slipped free from an invisible rope tightening around his chest. That evening, Sheriff Tom Caldwell stopped by. No patrol car, no notebook, just a friendly piece of advice. "Some things," he said, "are better left alone, because sometimes the one who pays the price is not the one who caused it." Ethan looked him in the eye. "What about the people who almost died?" The sheriff said nothing. As night fell, Ethan sat alone in the small house. The inheritance papers from Samuel Cole spread out in front of him. He read the old note again, slower this time. Outside, the wind moved through the wooden posts, whispering without end. The offers came too fast. The warnings came too late. And Ethan understood. If this piece of land frightened so many people, then whatever lies beneath it must be worth far more than the money they were willing to pay. That night, Ethan Cole did not sleep. The mountain wind howled through the farm, rattling against the old tin roof with dry, metallic clangs. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward the abandoned livestock shed at the far end of the land, the most unused part of the property, and the one Samuel Cole had once told him not to repair unless absolutely necessary. Ethan did not believe in gut feelings, but he did believe in signs. The floor of the shed had a patch of concrete that was slightly off color. Not large, but obvious enough for someone with experience to notice it had been broken up and re-poured in a hurry. Ethan took a crowbar and spent nearly an hour prying it loose. The stench of mold and cold earth rose up immediately. Beneath was a narrow space, not deep, but just deep enough to hide something someone never wanted found. One by one, Ethan pulled up bundles wrapped in old oilcloth, notebooks, transport records, nameless labor cards. Many pages had faded ink, but they were still readable. Names, numbers, dates, repeating symbols like part of a system running smoothly. At the bottom, he found a long, sealed plastic tube. Inside were a geological map and groundwater survey documents, signed by a consulting firm over a decade ago. Ethan stood there for a long time. The farm was never just a livestock operation. It sat directly above a clean, high-capacity underground aquifer rare in this region, a water source large enough to support an entire industrial complex or a massive luxury resort. And if someone tried to tap into it publicly, people would start asking questions. A lot of questions. Undocumented laborers did not ask questions, and if they knew too much, they disappeared. Ethan thought back to Richard Hale's soft-spoken numbers, to Sheriff Caldwell's evasive gaze. Everything began to fall into place with a chilling clarity. At the end of the file, there was a small slip of paper, the handwriting old and firm. "This land is not valuable for what's on the surface. Its worth lies in what flows beneath." If you are reading this, it means you are standing at a crossroads. Samuel Cole. Ethan folded the note and looked up into the darkness that surrounded the shed. For the first time, he understood why this land had only cost $5. Not because it was worthless, but because too many people were afraid of the truth buried underneath it. And from that moment on, Ethan knew this was no longer about whether or not to sell. Ethan Cole spent the entire night reading through every page of the documents he had pulled from the shed's hidden chamber. He spread them across the wooden table, weighing down the corners with stones as the mountain wind kept slipping through the cracks in the door. Numbers, dates, symbols, none of it felt scattered anymore. They connected into a picture now, cold, clear. The farm was not the end point. It was a link in a chain. Ethan was not a man of the law, and he was certainly not used to facing off against powerful forces. But he understood one simple truth. If he sold the land now, everything in his hands would disappear. And those 6 women would become nothing more than a passing headline, quickly buried and forgotten. The next morning, Ethan drove down to town. No signs, no announcement. He met with an old lawyer who had handled land disputes most people avoided. Ethan did not tell the whole story. He just placed the bundle of documents on the desk. The man read in silence for a long time. "You understand," he said slowly. "If you go forward with this, there will be no turning back." Ethan nodded. "I never had a way back." The rumors spread faster than Ethan expected. Within days, people's eyes started to change. Strange cars slowed near the farm gate, then turned around. The phone rang at midnight, but no one spoke. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from Richard Hale. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," Hale said, his voice still calm. "The company is willing to increase the offer again." Ethan looked out at the fields, where dry grass swayed in the wind. "You do not understand," he replied. "This is not about price anymore." The call ended quickly. That evening, Ethan visited the hospital. Zhou Ying was able to sit up. Lin Xiaoyu looked at him as he entered, not with the panic from before, but with weariness and caution. Ethan did not make promises. He simply said, "I will not let this be buried." No one applauded. No one believed him right away. But for the first time, they did not look away. As night fell, Ethan returned to the farm. He stood in front of the old shed, where the secret had once been buried deep. The wind was stronger now, carrying the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. Ethan knew exactly what he was doing. He was standing between those with power and money, and those who only had their lives left. And this time, the caretaker of the $5 land had made his choice: to stand tall, hold the ground, and never bow. Winter arrived earlier than usual. Every morning, the farm lay under a thin veil of mist, but it no longer felt cold the way it once did. Ethan Cole woke up early, lit the fireplace, brewed coffee, and opened the door to look out over the fields. In recent days, he was no longer alone, even though the road ahead was still filled with risk. An official investigation had begun, quietly. No press conferences, no headlines, but enough to keep certain people up at night. Federal vehicles appeared silently around town. Behind closed doors, private meetings were held. Richard Hale no longer called, and Sheriff Tom Caldwell stopped dropping by the farm with vague advice. At the hospital, the 6 women were slowly recovering. Zhou Ying spoke more fluently. Zhang Mei had started eating again. Wang Fen walked slowly down the hallway, always turning back to check if the others were keeping up. Sun Qian was still weak, but she could smile now, a small, careful smile, as if afraid it might break the fragile peace. The day they agreed to testify, there were no tears, no dramatics. Just a nod, one by one. Chen Lihua placed her statement on the table, her hand steady. She had been holding it in for too long. Ethan did not sit in the interview room. He waited outside, watching through the glass. He understood. Justice was not something he could deliver for them. It began with letting them speak in their own voice. The farm became the center of a storm of old questions rising again. Forgotten files were reopened. Routes that had once never existed were drawn back onto the map. The underground water, once hidden, was now undeniable evidence. One afternoon, Ethan received a brief message from the lawyer. They cannot ignore it anymore. He turned off the phone and stood in the open field, where it had all begun. The wind moved through the wooden posts, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth. There was no cheering, no sense of victory. Only a slow-spreading relief, like a wound finally bandaged the right way. 6 women had lived. The truth had been named. And Ethan understood. Justice does not strike like thunder. It begins quietly with the decision not to look away while someone is still breathing. Spring came slowly, but unmistakably. The last patches of snow melted away across the fields, revealing dark, rich soil that had slept undisturbed for years. Ethan Cole stood on the front porch, a cup of hot coffee in hand, watching the farm slowly come back to life. What was once called cursed land now held a different kind of stillness, as if it had simply been waiting long enough for the right person to arrive. The investigations were no longer quiet. Files were reopened, cross-referenced, and made public. The names behind the so-called Sustainable Development Projects were brought into the light. Not all were punished right away, but the silence had ended. And for Ethan, that alone was real change. The farm was never sold. Instead, the rights to the underground water were placed into a new agreement, transparent, supervised, and with a protection fund designated for the local community. The wells were properly sealed. Power lines were extended to the property. The $5 plot finally earned the title it deserved, a foundation. The 6 women no longer lay in hospital beds. Zhou Ying stayed in town, working as an interpreter for an organization supporting migrant laborers. Zhang Mei and Wang Fen found work at another farm, this time paid and with respect. Chen Lihua entered a witness protection program. Sun Qian still needed time, but she came back to the farm once a week just to sit beneath a tree and breathe. One afternoon, Lin Xiaoyu stood beside Ethan by the old fence, now repaired and straight. She did not say much. She simply bowed her head deeply. Ethan did not stop her. Some thank yous do not need to be answered with words. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan walked along the land he now called his own. He remembered the day he signed the transfer papers, $5 in exchange for a place no one wanted. Back then he thought he was buying shelter. Now, he understood he had taken on a responsibility. Samuel Cole had been right. The value of this land was never in its dry soil or its cheap price. It was in what flowed beneath it, and in those who were strong enough not to walk away. Ethan stopped in the middle of the field, spring wind brushing softly against his coat. Some foundations are not built with money. They are built with choices and with the ability to see worth where the world sees none. Years later, people still spoke of that farm as a strange kind of story. Not because the land price had multiplied, and not because of the names that once made the news before vanishing. They remembered it for a different reason. It was the place where an ordinary man chose not to look away. Ethan Cole never saw himself as a hero. He was just a rancher who had stood before a very clear choice: stay silent and live more easily, or face the truth so others might have a chance to keep living. He chose the harder path, not out of bravery, but because he understood one simple thing: some prices, if not paid today, would be paid tomorrow by someone else. The 6 women had their names back, their lives back, and most importantly, their voices. The $5 farm was no longer a place of concealment, but a place of remembrance. That what is dismissed as worthless is sometimes only waiting for someone with enough resolve to see its real worth. That story left behind a lesson simple, but not easy to live by. In life, doing the right thing does not always come with immediate rewards. Sometimes it brings trouble, pressure, and loneliness. But it is exactly those quiet choices that build the strongest foundations for a person, for a community, or even for a generation. Not everyone has a $5 piece of land to protect. But everyone will, at some point, stand before a hidden truth, a vulnerable person, or a chance to turn away. And when that moment comes, a person's worth is not measured by what they own, but by the side they choose to stand on. Because in the end, the most enduring foundations are not built from money. They are built from resolve, responsibility, and the courage not to look away. The story you have just followed includes fictional elements, brought to life with the help of artificial intelligence. We invite you to listen with your own judgment and reflection. These fictional details are not meant to alter history, but to evoke the spirit of the old American West, a time when people lived through hardship, faced impossible choices, and accepted the cost of those choices. Through this story, I simply hope to share a few lasting lessons about compassion, love, and courage, things that still matter, no matter how much time has passed. I am glad you were here. If you felt connected or inspired by this story, feel free to subscribe to the channel so we can meet again next time. Thank you for being here. I love you all. True Wild West stories.